This is our third video dealing with our module on political geography, and again you should be reading chapter 8. We're going to shift gears here and move on to our case study looking at just the European Union. So our learning objective for this video is we're going to look at the geography, but also some of the main institutions that round out the architecture of what amounts to the world's largest supranational entity, and again that's the European Union. Let's start out by looking at a map of the European Union. We have a map of Europe here, and we have three different color codes. The blue, light blue, these are full-fledged members of the European Union. The green represent the two newest states that are now full-fledged members of the European Union. They are Romania and Bulgaria. And the kind of darker gray, that represents the three states that have applied, but they're not yet full members of the European Union. And we don't really know for sure whether or not they ever will be. They are Croatia, Macedonia, and then finally Turkey. Now let's talk about basically then what countries are currently full-fledged members of the European Union. You can see that it basically includes almost all of the states that we conventionally understand as Europe. There are exceptions though, and we need to cover just a few of them. Norway is not a member of the European Union. Norway didn't become a member. They were invited, but they declined, in part because they have oil wealth and they didn't really want to share it with their European neighbors. Neither is Switzerland. That kind of makes sense. Switzerland just doesn't really fit in with the rest of Europe. It has its own unique history and culture. But more importantly is this gap right here. Notice that Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and Albania are not members of the European Union. They haven't even been asked, and the reason is that part of Europe has been plagued by war and conflict in the last 20 years. And the European Union is basically almost an elite club of states that have democracy, human rights records, relatively high levels of wealth. And as a result, this part of Europe right here has not been invited to join. The same thing is true for these East European countries like Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. They have lower income. They tend to, over the course of the last 20 years, have not really made a great transition to capitalism and democracy. And as a result, they also are excluded from the European Union. So basically, the borders of the European Union correspond roughly with what we consider to be conventionally Europe, with some exceptions. Now, let's move on to an interesting point. I would like all of you to think of the EU as a place, as a supranational entity, where they're basically trying to create something that almost looks like the United States of America. Basically a single state, where each of the individual European states is kind of like the equivalent of our states, meaning Germany is like, I don't know, New York, and France is kind of like Pennsylvania, and so on. But still kind of moving towards this idea of a single state in the heart of Europe. And some of the things that they've done, just to give you a few examples, is they now have a single currency, like we have our dollar, and the borders between the individual European states are no longer as important. You can travel freely across them. They've also created a flag. So this is the flag of the EU that you will see flapping in the wind in various European capitals. And so they're basically trying to craft a European identity. They would like people in Europe to think of themselves as European and not so much as German, Italian, French, or what have you. So that's kind of the big point of the European Union, moving towards kind of creating almost what looks like a single state, a really big and powerful supranational entity. So let's move on to some of the details. This is basically our political geography case study, the EU presently. It is the world's largest supranational entity, supranational union, with about 500 million people living within those 27 member states. Because each state basically has its own language and ethnicity, that means it's internally very, very, very diverse. So I suppose it's kind of like a emerging single multinational state more than anything else. There are multiple languages and, of course, therefore, multiple ethnicities. But there are some common threads that are really important as well. And let me explain what some of them are. Today in Europe, in the EU, you have a single common market. Imagine that, 30 years ago, you didn't. Each country, each state, each individual state had their own marketplace, and they had their own tariff system and their own trade policy. Well, that's all gone now, and they've moved to a uniform, single common market. They also have that single currency called the euro, which is managed by a single central European bank. That's new. It's a way of, again, dissolving the borders internally, making the borders between the various states a little less important than they once were. A common trade policy and also a common agricultural policy. And remember that, 30 years ago, there were 27 distinct trade policies managed by 27 different countries. But now there's only one. So they're kind of streamlining, if you will, and homogenizing policy across a larger geographic area. And I would think the most important and most easy to illustrate the importance of it is this one right here. The EU has abolished passports and border checks internally for most member states. So I could get up in the morning in Germany and just drive to France, and I wouldn't have to even worry about my passport. There'd be no border patrol. I would just cross freely from one state into the other. Kind of like crossing the border between Wisconsin and Illinois today. You don't present paperwork when you cross from one state to another within the United States of America. What are some other institutions of the EU that make it more like the United States of Europe? Well, there's the European Court of Justice. That's kind of like our Supreme Court of America. They have a European Parliament. That's kind of like the the American Congress. And they have the European Central Bank, which is kind of like our Federal Reserve. So in a way, they're kind of moving towards that single state status. So let's show just one other way that that's the case. If you're going to have a single state, you probably need like a capital, a place where people get together and build laws and bureaucracy and determine policy. Well, they do have that, but instead of having just one official capital like we have with Washington, D.C., they actually have numerous capitals. Each one kind of plays its own special role. In Brussels, which is in Belgium, they have the European Commission. In Strasbourg, they have the European Parliament, which again is kind of like our Congress. And in Luxembourg City in Luxembourg, they have the Supreme Court. In other words, more specifically, the European Court of Justice. Now, the other thing that I want to do in this video is just talk about the geography of the EU a little bit more clearly and with an eye for history. I want to talk about how it expanded over time. It used to be, not that long ago, back in the 50s and 60s, that the EU was really tiny. There were only a few founding members. There were 6, and they're all pretty close to one another in northwestern Europe. You had Germany and France and Italy, and then a collection of small countries here called the Low Countries, and that would mean Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Now, it's in this part of Europe where you have the founding members of the EU. That means that they have been members of the EU the longest. They've probably invested more in the long-term success of the EU. Interestingly, it's also the part of Europe that was most devastated by World War II, and so they probably stood a lot to gain by making sure that war wouldn't happen in this part of Europe again. And one way to do that is to kind of weave all of these countries together into one single economic unit. So I'm hoping it kind of makes sense why this part of Europe is where the EU began. There was kind of a really great need to create a union in this part of Europe in the ashes of World War II. Now, what's happened over time, as you move forward from the 1950s, when these original members basically built the initial stages of the European Union, is that each decade it's expanded a little further. So you get to the 70s and you have these North European states that join the EU. In the 80s you have these Mediterranean or Southern European states, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, that join. And then again, you get some more North European states, Finland and Sweden in the 90s. But most importantly, in the 2000s, you get a huge number of new countries that join. And what they really all have in common is they're East European countries. So that's where the real dramatic expansion occurs. And also the most important, because a lot of these countries, Estonia, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, they used to be, 20 years ago, on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So to travel from Poland to France 20 years ago was really difficult. Maybe 30 years ago, if we wanted to be a little bit more accurate in terms of the history. But it used to be that Poland and France were not well integrated. But today, they're in the same supranational entity. And that means it's in Eastern Europe where these changes associated with the EU are probably more dramatically felt, where they've really done a 180, so to speak, in terms of their political orientation. And then finally, the two newest countries, also East European countries. So to summarize then, what's happened is the core of the EU, basically right through here, those are the founding members. That's where the EU began. And then progressively forward in time, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, it progressively pushes out to the periphery of Europe to include places like Sweden, Spain, Greece, and ultimately that big arc of territory through the heart of Eastern Europe, which is probably the biggest surprise. Nobody would have predicted that 20 years ago, because at that time the Soviet Union was still just beginning its disintegration, and a lot of those East European countries were on the other side of the so-called Iron Curtain. Now in our next video, we'll look at the EU through a somewhat different lens.